7 men, green painted faces, no dog tags, no identification, and orders that said if they got captured, the United States government would pretend they never existed. March 15th, 1968. The Mekong Delta. A night so dark the water looked like liquid tar. These Navy SEALs were hunting a man the CIA had been chasing for 11 months. 11 months. The entire American intelligence apparatus couldn't find this guy. But what these operators discovered inside his mud hut, it wasn't just intelligence. It was a bombshell that made grown CIA officers physically sick when they read it. I'm talking about American faces in enemy files, classified documents that should have been locked in vaults thousands of miles away, and names that proved someone inside the American command structure had been feeding secrets directly to the Viet Cong. The Pentagon buried this story for over 40 years. They didn't want you to know how deep the betrayal went. They didn't want you to know that the enemy had been reading American battle plans almost in real time. And they definitely didn't want you to know what happened to the traitors they eventually caught. One of them died in a parachute accident 14 months after the investigation started. Funny thing about that accident, experienced skydivers said the official report didn't add up, but nobody wanted to ask too many questions. You're about to hear the full story of the Blacklist mission, the 90-second firefight in waist-deep water, the prisoner who almost drowned before he could talk, and the documents that revealed the American war effort in the Delta had been compromised from the very beginning. This is the mission that shocked the CIA. This is the story they tried to hide. Stay with me until the end, because what these SEALs found changes everything you thought you knew about Vietnam. Let's get into it. The rain hammered the Mekong Delta on the night of March 15th, 1968, when 7 men with green-painted faces slid into water so black it seemed to swallow light itself. They carried no identification. Their dog tags had been removed 3 days earlier. If captured, the United States government would deny their existence with the same ease a man denies knowing a stranger on the street. These were not soldiers in any conventional sense. These were Navy SEALs attached to a program so classified that even the Secretary of Defense received only sanitized summaries of its activities. The target that night was a mud-walled hut 17 kilometers inside territory controlled entirely by the Viet Cong. Inside that hut sat a man the CIA had been hunting for 11 months. His name appeared on no official documents. His photograph existed in exactly 3 files worldwide. But what they would find inside that hut would make the prisoner himself look like a minor prize. The man they sought was known only by his operational designation, Provincial Tax Collector 17. To the villagers of the Quien Hoa province, he was something far more terrifying. He was the man who decided which families lived and which families disappeared into the jungle, never to return. He maintained a network of informants so vast that American intelligence officers privately admitted they had nothing comparable. For nearly a year, every operation in his sector had been compromised. Ambushes that should have succeeded walked into counter-ambushes. Informants who provided good intelligence turned up floating in the canals with their tongues removed. And the body count on the American side kept climbing while the enemy seemed to know every move before it was made. Someone was feeding him information, someone with access to classified American operational planning. The CIA suspected a mole. The SEALs were sent to find proof. And they would find far more than anyone had bargained for. The 7 operators who slipped into the water that night represented the most dangerous concentration of human lethality ever assembled in the Mekong Delta. Their average age was 23 years old. Their average time in country was 14 months. In that 14 months, this particular squad had conducted over 90 operations. They had eliminated more than 130 confirmed enemy combatants. They had captured 22 prisoners who provided actionable intelligence, and they had never lost a single man. Not one. In a war where American casualties were measured in hundreds per week, this squad had achieved something approaching statistical impossibility. The Viet Cong had a name for them. Translated loosely, it meant the devils who come from the water. Tonight, the devils had come for Provincial Tax Collector 17. But the tax collector was about to give them something that would send shockwaves all the way to Washington. The intelligence package that preceded this mission ran to 47 pages of single-space type. It detailed the tax collector's daily movements, his known associates, his bodyguard rotation, and the layout of his compound. The CIA station chief in Cantho had spent 3 months developing this package, using assets whose identities remain classified to this day. The target was described as a high-value individual with possible access to the identity of American personnel, providing information to the enemy. The mission parameters were explicit. Capture was preferred. Elimination was authorized if capture proved impossible. All documents found on site were to be recovered regardless of their apparent significance. And then there was the final instruction. It was not typed, it was handwritten in the margin. Under no circumstances were any members of the assault team to be taken alive. The handwriting belonged to the CIA's Chief of Counterintelligence for the entire Mekong Delta region. The implications were clear. Whatever they found in that hut was considered more valuable than their lives. The insertion point was a narrow channel that the maps labeled as unnavigable. The SEALs had navigated it twice before on reconnaissance missions. They knew that at low tide, the water depth dropped to barely 18 inches in several spots. They knew that the mudbanks on either side were home to water snakes whose venom could incapacitate a man in under 4 minutes. They knew that the Viet Cong had strung wire across the channel at 2 points, wire connected to crude but effective explosive devices made from unexploded American ordnance. They knew all of this because they had spent the previous 3 weeks learning this channel the way a lover learns the body of his beloved, every curve, every depth, every danger. The Viet Cong believed this channel was impassable. That belief was about to cost them everything. Point man Eddie Gallagher moved through the water like a creature born to it. His movements created no ripples. His breathing made no sound. The suppressed Swedish K submachine gun strapped across his chest had been wrapped in cloth to prevent any metallic glint that might catch the moonlight. Behind him, the 6 other members of the squad maintained a spacing of exactly 3 meters, close enough to provide immediate support, far enough apart that a single burst of enemy fire could not eliminate the entire team. This was doctrine developed not in classrooms, but in the blood-soaked reality of 50 previous insertions. Every lesson had been paid for in the currency of American lives. These 7 men intended to spend no more of that currency tonight. But the jungle had other plans. The first wire appeared at the 11-minute mark of the insertion. Gallagher spotted it in the darkness through sheer instinct, a slight wrongness in the way the water moved against an obstacle that should not have been there. He raised his left fist. The squad froze. For 47 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then Gallagher reached down into the water with the delicacy of a surgeon and traced the wire to its source. The explosive device was a modified American 81mm mortar round. The Viet Cong had attached a simple pressure release mechanism that would detonate the round if the wire was cut or pulled. Gallagher did neither. Instead, he followed the wire to its anchor point on the bank and carefully lifted the entire assembly from the mud. The device was neutralized without a sound. He placed it gently on the bank for recovery on the extraction. American ordnance would not eliminate American operators. Not tonight. But the second trap was waiting just 8 minutes ahead. The second wire was more sophisticated than the first. It featured a secondary trigger that would activate if the primary mechanism was tampered with. Gallagher studied it for nearly 3 minutes before identifying the solution. The Viet Cong had made a single mistake in their construction. The secondary trigger required continuous electrical current from a battery mounted on the bank. That battery was connected by a thin copper wire that ran along the surface of the mud. Gallagher traced the wire, found the battery, and simply disconnected it. The secondary trigger died. The primary mechanism could now be bypassed using standard procedure. 2. Obstacles eliminated. 15 more minutes of movement required to reach the target compound. The tax collector had no idea that death was gliding toward him through the darkness. The tax collector's compound appeared through the tree line at precisely 02:17 hours. Intelligence had described a modest structure. The reality was something more substantial. The main hut was larger than expected, measuring roughly 8 meters by 6 meters. A secondary structure stood approximately 20 meters to the north. This one smaller, but featuring a thatched roof that had been recently repaired. 2 guards were visible at the main entrance to the compound. A third guard patrolled a circuit that took him around the perimeter every 7 to 8 minutes. The SEALs had observed this patrol pattern for 3 weeks. Tonight, the guard completed his circuit in 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Right on schedule. Predictability in a war zone was the same as a sentence of termination. The guard simply did not know it yet. Squad leader Lieutenant Michael Collins made the call at 02:22 hours. The assault would proceed in 3 phases. First, the perimeter guard would be neutralized silently during the blind spot in his patrol where the main hut blocked the view of the 2 entrance guards. Second, the entrance guards would be eliminated simultaneously using suppressed weapons fired from positions established during the previous 60 seconds. Third, the assault element would enter the main hut, secure the target, and begin document exploitation while the security element maintained the perimeter. Total time from initiation to extraction was estimated at 12 to 15 minutes. Any longer than that risked discovery by the reaction force known to be stationed approximately 3 kilometers to the south. The SEALs had rehearsed this assault 17 times on a mock-up constructed at their base in Na Bay. They could execute it blindfolded. Tonight, they would execute it for real, and what they would find inside would change everything they thought they knew about this war. The perimeter guard never heard the man who ended his participation in the conflict. Petty Officer Second Class. Robert Thornton materialized from the darkness like a nightmare given flesh. His left hand clamped over the guard's mouth with a pressure that prevented any sound. His right hand performed an action with a 7-inch blade that the training manuals described in clinical terms, but which in practice was something far more visceral. The guard's body was lowered to the ground without a sound. Thornton dragged it into the vegetation. 43 seconds from initiation to completion. The first phase was complete. The clock was now running, and the entrance guards had exactly 4 seconds left to live. They were discussing something in low voices when the suppressed rounds found them. The Swedish K-submachine guns used by the SEALs had been modified to reduce their already minimal sound signature to something approaching a loud cough. The guards collapsed in a manner that suggested their strings had been cut by an invisible hand. Neither managed to raise an alarm. Neither managed to discharge a weapon. Neither managed to do anything except transition from the category of living combatant to the category of eliminated threat. The second phase was complete. Time elapsed. 61 seconds. Now came the moment that would haunt several of these men for the rest of their lives. The assault element hit the door of the main hut at 02:24 hours. Provincial tax collector. 17 was not alone. He was seated at a crude wooden table covered with documents, maps, and what appeared to be photographs. Beside him sat a woman who would later be identified as his courier. At the far end of the hut, 2 additional men lay on sleeping mats. All 4 individuals were awake. All 4 reached for weapons. None of them completed the motion. The SEALs' fire discipline was absolute. Controlled bursts eliminated the threats in under 3 seconds. The tax collector took a round through the shoulder that spun him away from the table and onto the floor. He was alive, he was conscious, and he was now the property of the United States Navy. But it was what lay on that table that turned a successful capture mission into something unprecedented. Lieutenant Collins approached the table while 2 of his men secured the wounded tax collector. The documents spread across the wooden surface were not what anyone had expected. There were no lists of village contributions, no records of rice requisitions, no mundane administrative papers of the type usually recovered from Viet Cong tax collectors. Instead, Collins found himself staring at a collection of materials that made his blood run cold. There were photographs, American photographs, official photographs from personnel files that should have been stored in secure facilities thousands of miles from this mud hut in the Mekong Delta. There were documents bearing classification markings that Collins recognized from his own briefings. And there were names, American names, names of Vietnamese nationals working for the CIA, names of village chiefs who had cooperated with pacification programs, names of South Vietnamese military officers who had provided intelligence to American forces. The tax collector had not been collecting taxes. He had been collecting something far more valuable. He had been collecting the identities of everyone who opposed the communist cause in the Quien Hoa province. And that was only the first layer of the nightmare. Beneath the photographs and the lists, Collins found a second layer of documents that explained how Provincial Tax Collector 17 had acquired his devastating information. There were carbon copies of American operational orders. There were transcripts of radio communications that should have been encrypted. There were summaries of intelligence briefings that had taken place in facilities that Vietnamese nationals were never permitted to enter. Someone with access to the highest levels of American operational planning had been feeding information directly to this man in this hut for at least 11 months. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Collins began shoving documents into his extraction bag with hands that he later admitted were shaking. The tax collector was watching all of this with an expression that Collins would describe in his after-action report as inappropriately calm. The man had just taken a bullet through his left shoulder. He had just watched his companions eliminated in a matter of seconds. He was lying on the dirt floor of his hut with 2 Navy SEALs pointing weapons at his head. And yet, he seemed almost amused. Later, under interrogation, he would explain that amusement. He knew that the documents Collins was recovering represented only a fraction of the intelligence network he had constructed. He knew that the names on those lists were already compromised, and that his superiors had certainly moved to new systems of communication the moment his capture became known. And he knew something else, something that would keep American counterintelligence officers awake for months. The true scope of the penetration into American operations would never be discovered from what was in this hut. The SEALs had found the tumor, but the cancer had already spread throughout the body. The extraction phase began at 02:31 hours. Collins made the decision to abort the full document exploitation due to time constraints. They had been on target for 7 minutes. The reaction force would be alerted soon. Every additional minute increased the risk of contact during extraction. The team grabbed everything they could carry. The wounded tax collector was bound, gagged, and prepared for water movement. 2 SEALs would swim him out while the remainder of the team provided security. It was an awkward configuration, but the intelligence value of a live prisoner was considered worth the tactical compromise. Collins gave the signal. The SEALs began their withdrawal. They had covered approximately 200 meters when the jungle exploded with gunfire. The reaction force had responded faster than anticipated. Someone in the village had apparently heard something despite all the precautions, or perhaps the timing was simply bad luck. The Viet Cong platoon coming down the trail had not been part of any intelligence estimate. They were a mobile element that happened to be transiting through the area at precisely the wrong moment. The point man spotted the SEALs in the channel at the same instant the SEALs spotted him. Both sides opened fire simultaneously. The next 90 seconds would determine whether any of the Americans survived to deliver their precious cargo. Petty Officer Thornton later described those 90 seconds as the longest of his life. The SEALs were caught in water roughly waist deep, with virtually no cover. The Viet Cong had the advantage of solid ground and vegetation. By every tactical calculation, the Americans should have been slaughtered. They were not. The suppressing fire laid down by the security element was so intense and so accurate that the Viet Cong assault stalled before it properly began. The enemy had expected to overwhelm a small patrol. Instead, they had walked into a volume of fire that suggested they had engaged a force 3 times the actual size. The Stoner 63 light machine gun, carried by Petty Officer Williams, performed exactly as advertised, sending over 200 rounds downrange in a continuous stream that shredded vegetation and flesh with equal efficiency. But the prisoner was drowning, and the documents were getting wet. The 2 SEALs tasked with moving the tax collector had to choose between keeping him above water and keeping themselves below the line of enemy fire. They chose a compromise that left all 3 of them intermittently submerged. The tax collector swallowed enough canal water to require medical attention for aspiration pneumonia upon return to base. But he survived, and more importantly for the intelligence community, he remained capable of interrogation. The documents in the extraction bags also survived, protected by waterproof containers that the SEALs had learned to carry after losing critical intelligence to water damage on 3 previous operations. Every lesson in this war was written in the ink of experience. The SEALs had learned their lessons well. The contact broke at the 4-minute mark when the Viet Cong attempted a flanking maneuver that exposed them to the secondary fire team. 5 enemy fighters went down in a space of approximately 8 seconds. The remainder of the platoon decided that whatever they had stumbled upon was not worth additional casualties. They withdrew into the jungle. The SEALs continued their extraction. No pursuit materialized. The 7 SEALs and their prisoner reached the extraction point at 03:17 hours. A Navy boat was waiting. By 03:45 hours, they were back at the base in Nabi. By 0400 hours, CIA officers were already sorting through the documents Collins had recovered, and what they found would shock them to their core. The CIA station in Can Tho received the captured documents at approximately 0700 hours on the morning following the raid. The officer who first examined the materials later described his reaction as something between nausea and fascination. He had spent 18 months running agents in the Delta. He had recruited informants, developed networks, and carefully constructed an infrastructure of human intelligence that he believed was providing accurate information to American forces. The documents from the tax collector's hut revealed that his entire operation had been compromised from nearly the beginning. Names of his agents appeared on lists marked for elimination. Dates of his meetings with informants were recorded with precision that suggested direct observation. Summaries of the intelligence his agents had provided were annotated with corrections that demonstrated the Viet Cong had better information about some subjects than the CIA itself possessed. The station chief was looking at the autopsy report of his own operation, but the horror was only beginning. The coordination evident in the captured documents suggested a level of enemy capability that no one had anticipated. The tax collector had not been operating in isolation. His lists had been compiled from multiple sources. His intelligence had been verified through independent channels. His annotations referenced reports from other districts and other provinces that indicated a network far larger than anything American analysts had projected. The Viet Cong had built a counterintelligence apparatus that rivaled anything the CIA itself had created. And that apparatus had been quietly documenting American operations while American commanders congratulated themselves on their tactical superiority. The first priority was damage assessment. The results were devastating. Of the 47 Vietnamese nationals believed to be providing reliable intelligence to American forces in Cayenne Hoa Province, 39 appeared on lists recovered from the tax collector. Of those 39, 11 were known to have been eliminated by the Viet Cong in the previous 6 months. The remaining 28 were presumed to be either under enemy control or in imminent danger of elimination. Effectively, the entire human intelligence network in the province had been neutralized. Years of careful recruitment and development had been undone by penetrations that American counterintelligence had completely failed to detect. But the real question remained unanswered. Who was feeding classified American intelligence to the enemy? The second priority was identifying the source of the leaks. This proved considerably more difficult than damage assessment. The documents suggested multiple avenues of penetration, not all of which pointed to the same individuals. Some intelligence had clearly come from Vietnamese nationals with access to American facilities. Some appeared to derive from communication intercepts that indicated possible breaches in encryption security. And some, this was the most disturbing category, seemed to reflect knowledge that could only have come from American personnel with direct access to classified operational planning. The tax collector had possessed information that should have been restricted to a handful of American officers. Someone in that handful had been feeding it to the enemy. The hunt for the traitors had begun. The investigation that followed generated a paper trail that remained classified for over 40 years. Counterintelligence officers interrogated dozens of American and Vietnamese personnel. They analyzed communication patterns and access records. They constructed timelines and compared them to the dates on captured documents. They employed techniques of investigation that ranged from sophisticated analysis to crude intimidation. And eventually, they identified 3 individuals whose access matched the profile of the leak. 2 were American military personnel assigned to intelligence functions. 1 was a civilian contractor with access to translation services. All 3 had opportunity. All 3 had demonstrated behaviors that raised suspicions under scrutiny. None of them confessed despite intensive questioning that reportedly approached the limits of what was legally permissible. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. One of the American officers had maintained contact with a Vietnamese woman whose family connections to the Viet Cong had not been properly investigated before his relationship with her began. The second had accumulated gambling debts that exceeded his official income by a factor of approximately 7. The civilian contractor had expressed political views in private correspondence that suggested sympathy for the anti-war movement. Any of these factors might have created vulnerability to recruitment by enemy intelligence. All three were present in all three individuals. The probability that this was coincidental approached zero. What happened next was swift, brutal, and largely invisible to the public. The two military officers were transferred out of Vietnam within 6 weeks of the identification. Their security clearances were revoked pending investigation. One was subsequently court-martialed on charges related to mishandling classified information. The charges did not mention espionage. The evidence was insufficient for capital charges, but the court-martial resulted in a dishonorable discharge and a sentence of 5 years confinement at the United States Disciplinary Barracks at Fort Leavenworth. The second officer resigned his commission before charges could be filed. His resignation was accepted without comment. He disappeared into civilian life and refused all subsequent contact with investigators. The civilian contractor's fate was more ambiguous and far more disturbing. He left Vietnam approximately 3 months after the investigation began. Official records indicate that he returned to the United States and resumed his previous occupation. 14 months later, he was reported to have perished in an accident during a recreational parachute jump in Arizona. The investigation into his end concluded that his main parachute had failed to deploy properly and that his reserve parachute had deployed too late to arrest his descent. Experienced skydivers who reviewed the report noted several anomalies in the official account, but declined to press the matter. The civilian contractor had possessed information that certain agencies had strong interests in keeping secret. His departure from this world ensured that information would never become public. None of these outcomes satisfied the officers who had conducted the original investigation. They knew that the three identified individuals could not account for all the intelligence that had reached the tax collector. The penetrations were too extensive. The sources were too varied. The methods of collection were too sophisticated. Either additional traitors remained unidentified, or the enemy had developed capabilities for gathering intelligence that went beyond human sources. Both possibilities were deeply disturbing. Both suggested that the American presence in Vietnam was fundamentally compromised in ways that could not be easily addressed. The investigation was eventually closed without definitive conclusions. The file was classified at a level that ensured it would not be reviewed for at least 50 years, and the Navy SEALs who had made all of this possible received no briefing on the investigation's results. Their role had ended when they delivered the prisoner and documents to the CIA station. What happened afterward was above their pay grade and outside their operational scope. They returned to their routine of raids and ambushes and prisoner snatches without knowing the full significance of what they had accomplished. This was standard procedure for special operations during the Vietnam War. The operators gathered the intelligence. The analysts exploited the intelligence, and the connection between gathering and exploitation was often invisible to both parties. The SEALs knew they had captured something important. They did not know exactly how important until decades later. The prisoner interrogation facility in Saigon was a building that appeared on no maps and existed in no official records. Located in a residential district that had seen better days, it occupied what had once been a French colonial villa, complete with ornamental ironwork and a garden that had gone to seed. The exterior gave no indication of the structure's true purpose. Neighbors, if they noticed anything at all, saw only a steady stream of official vehicles arriving at odd hours and departing with equal discretion. The building had no sign. It had no guards visible from the street. It had nothing that might attract the attention of journalists or aid workers or anyone else who might ask inconvenient questions about what happened inside its thick walls. Provincial tax collector. 17 arrived at this facility approximately 36 hours after his capture. The journey from Na Bay had involved multiple vehicles, several changes of escort, and at least 2 intermediate stops, whose purpose was never explained to him. The wound in his shoulder had been treated by an American medic during one of these stops, competently but without anesthetic. He had been given water but no food. He had been permitted to use sanitary facilities but always under close observation. And he had been spoken to exactly once during the entire journey, when an American officer informed him in passable Vietnamese that cooperation would be rewarded while resistance would be unproductive. The tax collector was about to learn exactly what unproductive meant. The interrogation began within hours of his arrival. The CIA officers who conducted the initial sessions employed methods that would later become controversial, but which at the time were considered standard practice for high-value detainees. The tax collector was not tortured in any sense that would leave permanent physical damage. He was, however, subjected to conditions designed to maximize psychological stress and minimize his ability to resist questioning. Sleep deprivation, temperature manipulation, isolation alternating with intense personal attention. The techniques were borrowed from studies of communist interrogation methods and refined through years of practice in conflicts from Korea to Cuba. They worked, but the tax collector proved more resilient than expected. The tax collector began providing useful information on the third day of his interrogation. He started with details that he believed American intelligence already possessed, confirming facts about his network that he assumed had been compromised by the captured documents. When these confirmations proved accurate, his interrogators pressed for information that went beyond what the documents had revealed. Names of individuals who had not appeared on the lists, methods of communication that had not been documented, locations of facilities that had not been mapped. The tax collector resisted providing this information initially, not from personal courage, but from calculation. He understood that his value as a prisoner depended on having more to reveal. He parceled out his knowledge in increments designed to extend his usefulness. The interrogators understood this game. They had played it many times before, and they were patient. They knew that a prisoner's initial resistance would eventually break down under the cumulative pressure of their methods. They knew that information provided reluctantly was often more reliable than information provided eagerly. And they knew that the tax collector, whatever his skills in managing Viet Cong intelligence operations, was not a trained resistance operative. He had never been prepared for the possibility of capture. He had no established protocols for misleading interrogators. He was making up his resistance strategy as he went along, and that improvisation was about to fail him spectacularly. The breakthrough came on the 19th day. The tax collector had been providing increasingly detailed information about his network's operations for several days, but he had consistently refused to discuss one topic: the sources of his intelligence about American operations. He claimed ignorance. He claimed that information came to him through channels he did not control. He claimed that he was merely a collector of intelligence, not a handler of sources. His interrogators did not believe these claims, but they lacked specific evidence to contradict them. Then, on the 19th day, one of the captured documents was presented to him with a question that changed the dynamic of the entire interrogation. The document was a summary of an American operational planning meeting that had taken place in Can Tho approximately 6 weeks before the tax collector's capture. The summary was accurate in every detail that could be verified. It included references to specific individuals who had attended the meeting, specific proposals that had been discussed, and specific decisions that had been reached. The interrogator asked a simple question: how had the tax collector obtained this information? The meeting had been classified. No Vietnamese nationals had been present. The content had been transmitted only through secure American communication channels. There was no conceivable way for this information to have reached the tax collector through Vietnamese sources alone. Someone with access to American classified information had provided it directly, and the tax collector's face revealed that he knew exactly what that meant. The tax collector's response revealed the depth of the penetration for the first time. He did not admit to knowing the identity of the American source. He may genuinely not have known, or he may have been protecting an asset whose value exceeded his own. But he did admit that information of this type had been flowing to his network for at least 18 months. He admitted that the source, or sources, had access to material classified at levels that the interrogators found alarming, and he admitted that the intelligence provided by these sources had been instrumental in the Viet Cong's ability to anticipate and counter American operations throughout the Mekong Delta. The implications were staggering. If the tax collector's account was accurate, the enemy had been reading American operational planning almost in real time for the better part of 2 years. Every major operation during that period had been potentially compromised. Every tactical decision had been potentially anticipated. Every advantage that American forces believed they possessed had been potentially nullified by an enemy who knew what was coming before it arrived. The body counts that commanders cited as evidence of progress were meaningless if the enemy had been choosing where and when to take casualties. The operational successes that had been celebrated as victories were hollow if the enemy had been controlling which operations succeeded and which failed. The entire American strategy in the Mekong Delta had been built on a foundation of sand. The interrogators immediately escalated their findings to the highest levels of the intelligence community. Reports were transmitted to Saigon, to Washington, to Langley. Counterintelligence operations that had been operating with low priority were suddenly given all available resources. The search for the American sources who had betrayed their country became one of the most intensive investigations of the entire war. And the SEALs who had made this investigation possible were never informed of the magnitude of what their single-night operation had revealed. The tax collector did not survive the end of the war. After his interrogation was complete, he was transferred to South Vietnamese custody as a prisoner of war. The South Vietnamese detention system was not known for its humanitarian standards. The tax collector was confined in a facility where conditions were harsh and medical care was minimal. His shoulder wound, inadequately treated during his time in American custody, developed complications that were never properly addressed. He perished of what the official record described as natural causes, though the definition of natural in that context was considerably broader than civilian usage would suggest. His end ensured that certain secrets would never be revealed. Whatever he had concealed went with him. The blacklist mission file was finally closed in 1974. By then, American involvement in Vietnam was effectively over. The investigation into the American sources had produced results that satisfied no one. The SEALs who had conducted the raid had rotated home and moved on to other assignments or civilian lives. The moment of maximum vulnerability that the mission had revealed had passed without being properly exploited, and the opportunity to fundamentally compromise the Viet Cong's intelligence capabilities had been lost in the slow grinding of bureaucratic process. The Navy SEALs who served in Vietnam became legends within the special operations community. Their exploits were studied at training facilities long after the war ended. Their tactics were refined and passed on to subsequent generations of operators. Their willingness to operate in conditions that would have broken conventional forces became the standard by which all future SEALs measured themselves. But the specific missions they conducted remained largely unknown to the general public. The Blacklist raid was one of hundreds of similar operations that achieved significant results while generating virtually no publicity. The men who conducted these operations wanted it that way. Fame was for peacetime soldiers. In war, the best operators were those whose names never appeared in any newspaper. The 7 SEALs who conducted the Blacklist raid received no public recognition for their achievement. There were no medals awarded in public ceremonies. There were no newspaper articles describing their courage. There was only a brief entry in a classified operational summary that noted the successful capture of a high-value target and the recovery of significant intelligence materials. The entry did not describe the 90-second firefight. It did not describe the near drowning of the prisoner. It did not describe the documents that revealed the depth of enemy penetration into American operations. It described nothing that might indicate the true significance of what had occurred on the night of March 15th, 1968. The SEALs expected nothing more. Anonymity was the price of operating in the shadows. They paid that price willingly. Lieutenant Collins rotated home in the summer of 1969. He had spent 22 months in country, a tenure that exceeded normal deployment lengths by a substantial margin. He had led over 120 operations. He had earned decorations that he rarely discussed and scars that he never showed. The man who returned to the United States bore little resemblance to the man who had departed 22 months earlier. His wife later described living with a stranger for the first several years after his return. The things he had seen and done in the Delta had fundamentally altered his psychology in ways that neither he nor anyone else fully understood. This was the hidden cost of operating in the shadows. The missions remained classified, the wounds remained invisible, and the men who bore those wounds received little support from a nation that preferred not to acknowledge what had been done in its name. But Collins never regretted the work. In interviews conducted decades later, Long after the details of the blacklist mission were finally declassified, he maintained that the operations he led had been necessary and effective. The tax collector network had been a genuine threat to American personnel and Vietnamese allies alike. Eliminating that threat had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to betrayal. Collins made no apologies for what he had done. He asked for no forgiveness. He simply stated the facts as he understood them and left judgment to those who had earned the right to judge. The Mekong Delta today bears few traces of the conflict that once consumed it. The canals still wind through the landscape in patterns that would be recognizable to any veteran of the war. The villages still cluster along the waterways in configurations that date back centuries. But the bunkers have been filled in. The defensive positions have been reclaimed by vegetation. The locations where American forces fought and bled have been transformed into rice paddies and fish farms that show no evidence of their violent past. The tax collector's hut is long gone now. The location where it once stood has been absorbed into a landscape that shows no trace of its history. But what 7 men found in that mud hut continues to echo through the decades. It revealed what was possible when the right men were sent to do the right job at the right time. The Blacklist mission was not the largest operation of the Vietnam War. It was not the bloodiest. It was not the most celebrated, but it was one of the most important. 7 Navy SEALs accomplished in a single night what the entire American intelligence community had failed to accomplish in 11 months. That shocked the CIA more than the documents themselves. The professionals had been outperformed by the warriors. The bureaucrats had been shown up by men with painted faces and suppressed weapons. And the truth about the depth of enemy penetration into American operations had been dragged out of a mud hut in the Mekong Delta by operators who were never supposed to exist. This is the story that the Pentagon tried to hide. Now you know why.